Some say the most dangerous predator is the one you don't see coming. Others say it's the one with nothing left to lose. But the deadliest hunter of all? That's the prey who decides to stop running. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn filtered through the towering pine trees of Blackridge Forest, casting long shadows across Diane Reynolds' modest cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney as she moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. At 42, Diane had the lean build of someone who lived off the land, with observant eyes that missed nothing and calloused hands that told stories of self-reliance. 5 years had passed since she'd received the folded flag and her husband's medals. Jason Reynolds, Army Special Forces, had died in some classified operation overseas, leaving Diane alone in the cabin his mother had left them. Since then, she'd retreated further into the wilderness, coming to town only when absolutely necessary. Oh, for supplies! Another day in paradise, she murmured to herself, stepping onto the porch and breathing in the crisp mountain air. The forest was alive with morning sounds, birds calling, squirrels chattering. This was her home now, her sanctuary, the place where she felt closest to Jason. Meanwhile, in the small town of Blackridge, Mayor Frank Walsh stood behind his desk, looking at a large map of the county spread across the surface. His pinky finger, adorned with a gaudy gold ring, tapped impatiently on a circled area of forest. Across from him, Victor Mercer, a sharp-dressed land developer with cold eyes, studied the map with calculation. "This is the last parcel we need." "Frank," Victor said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "once we secure those 500 acres, Blackridge Resort can break ground by spring." "Don't you think I know that?" the mayor replied, frustration evident in his tone. "But this section here—" He jabbed at a small area on the map. "The Reynolds property sits right in the middle. Everything else has been secured. So make her an offer. Everyone has a price." The mayor laughed bitterly. "We've tried 3 times. That woman is impossible. She refuses to even meet with our representatives." Victor's jaw tightened. "I've invested too much to let one stubborn widow derail this project. The Reynolds property is the linchpin. It connects the lake access to the main development site. Margaret Reynolds left that cabin and gave land to her daughter-in-law 5 years ago. Ever since her son died overseas, Diane's been living up there like some kind of mountain hermit, barely comes to town except for supplies." "What exactly happened to her husband?" Victor asked, his interest piqued. "Jason Reynolds, Army Special Forces, died in some classified operation. She got the folded flag, a medal, and not much else. After that, she just disappeared into that forest." Victor drummed his fingers on the desk, considering this information. "Maybe we need to be more persuasive." "Now hold on," Mayor Walsh said nervously. "I agreed to help push through some zoning changes, not—" "Relax, Frank," Victor interrupted. "I'm talking about motivation, not intimidation." He pulled out a checkbook. "Double the offer. Everyone has a breaking point." Later that morning, Diane parked her weathered pickup truck outside Miller's General Store. The small town of Blackridge had seen better days. Empty storefronts lined the main street, with only the essentials still in business. The population sign at the town limits, reading 2,436, hadn't been updated in years, and the actual number was surely lower. Inside, Diane moved efficiently through the aisles, selecting ammunition, first aid supplies, and non-perishable food. At the counter, Earl Miller, the store's elderly owner, greeted her with a warm smile. "Been a while, Diane. How's life up on the mountain?" "Quiet. Just the way I like it," she replied, placing her items on the counter. "Well, you might be getting some neighbors soon. The whole town's talking about this Blackridge Resort business, promising jobs, tourism dollars." Diane's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened. "Is that right?" "Yep." The mayor's been singing its praises, says it'll put us back on. The map. As Earl rang up her purchases, he lowered his voice. Some fella came in asking about you yesterday. Suit type. Asked where your property was located exactly. Diane stiffened slightly. Thanks for telling me. I played dumb, of course, told him I didn't know much. Earl bagged her supplies carefully. They're holding a town meeting tonight about the resort. Might want to attend, hear what they're planning. Diane nodded, paid for her supplies and headed for the door. As she exited, she noticed a sleek black SUV parked across the street, 2 men in suits watching her from inside. She mentally noted the license plate, then continued loading her truck as if she hadn't noticed. The town hall was packed that evening. Diane slipped quietly into the back, keeping to the shadows as Mayor Walsh stood at the podium, flanked by large promotional posters showing gleaming buildings nestled against pristine wilderness. Blackridge Resort will bring over 300 permanent jobs to our community, not counting the construction phase. This is the economic lifeline our town has been waiting for. Applause rippled through the crowd. Victor Mercer stepped forward, his charisma palpable as he addressed the townspeople. We're not just building a resort, we're revitalizing Blackridge. Imagine your children and grandchildren being able to find good jobs right here at home instead of moving away. From her position at the back, Diane studied the faces in the crowd. Most seemed enthusiastic, hungry for the promised prosperity. But she noticed a few, mostly older residents, who looked skeptical. I'm proud to announce that we've secured 98% of the necessary land already, Victor continued. Construction teams are ready to mobilize. The only thing standing between you and this brighter future is one small parcel. The room went quiet. Mayor Walsh shifted uncomfortably. One individual who, for personal reasons, is holding up progress that would benefit everyone in this community. Heads began to turn. Someone pointed toward Diane. The crowd's energy shifted, curious eyes finding her in the shadows at the back of the room. Mrs. Reynolds, Victor called out, his voice carrying throughout the hall. We understand your attachment to your property. That's why we're prepared to offer double our previous offer. That's 4 times market value. Diane remained still, her face impassive as murmurs spread through the room. Come on, Diane. This is good for all of us, called out a former high school classmate she barely recognized anymore. We need those jobs, shouted another voice. The weight of accusatory stares became too heavy. Diane moved toward the exit, but before she reached the door, she turned to face the crowd. That land's not for sale, she said firmly. Not at any price. The room erupted in angry murmurs as she stepped outside into the cool night air. She walked briskly toward her truck, but before she reached it, Victor emerged from the shadows. Mrs. Reynolds, Victor Mercer. I was hoping we could speak privately. I said all I needed to say inside, Diane replied, continuing toward her vehicle. I understand your position, but perhaps you don't fully understand ours. 2 men stepped out from behind a nearby car, Cruz and Walker, both with the hard eyes of men who solve problems through force. They didn't approach, but established their presence. That cabin holds sentimental value, I'm sure, Victor continued, but sentiment doesn't pay bills. We could set you up somewhere nice, comfortable. You wouldn't need to live like a survivalist. My husband and his mother built that cabin by hand, Diane said, her voice steady. It's where he wanted to come home to. Victor's voice hardened. But he didn't come home, did he? Diane's eyes flashed dangerously, but she controlled her reaction. $5 million, Mrs. Reynolds. That's my final offer. Enough to start a new life anywhere you want. My life isn't for sale either. She turned and continued toward her truck. You should know, Victor called after her. The county is reviewing some outdated property lines. There might be some discrepancies that affect your claim. Diane paused, but didn't turn around. It would be a shame if legal complications forced a sale anyway, at a much lower value. Or if the Forest Service suddenly found safety violations at your cabin. Things get very dangerous in those woods. Accidents happen. Diane turned slowly. Yes, they do. Their eyes locked in silent challenge. Victor smiled, but it didn't reach. His eyes, sleep on it, we'll be in touch. As Diane drove away, she checked her rearview mirror. The black SUV she had noticed earlier pulled out to follow her. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. This was intimidation, plain and simple. Back at her cabin, Diane moved purposefully through the darkness. She didn't turn on any lights. Instead, she went directly to a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard and retrieved a satellite phone. She dialed quickly. "It's me," she said when the call connected. "They're making their move." "How aggressive?" asked a male voice on the other. "And veiled threats. 2 muscle types, they're following me. Need backup?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Diane looked at a photo on the mantel, herself in younger days, standing beside Jason, both in military uniform. Not yet. But be ready. She ended the call and moved to a locked chest in the bedroom. Inside were items that revealed another side of her. Military-grade tactical gear, communication equipment, maps marked with strategic positions throughout the surrounding forest, and a collection of weapons that would impress even seasoned soldiers. Diane ran her finger across a worn patch with a distinctive insignia, the same one visible on Jason's uniform in the photo. Few people in town knew that before she'd met Jason, Diane had served in the same Special Operations Unit. They'd been partners in every sense of the word. "Time to hunt," she whispered. Meanwhile, the black SUV crept slowly along the winding road leading to Diane's property. Cruz drove while Walker scanned the trees with night vision binoculars. "The boss just wanted us to watch her, right?" Cruz asked, nervously tapping the steering wheel. "For now," Walker replied. "Get the layout, find her routines, weak points. Standard prep work. The place is in the middle of nowhere. No neighbors to hear anything. Perfect for what comes next if she doesn't take the money. Mercer wants this wrapped up by the end of the month." Suddenly, something darted across the road ahead. Cruz slammed on the brakes. "What the hell was that?" "Deer, probably," Walker said dismissively. "This whole area's crawling with wildlife." As they started moving again, neither noticed the small tracking device now attached to the underside of their vehicle. Back in her cabin, Diane sat at a table covered with maps and surveillance photos. A laptop showed the SUV's tracker moving along the road, then stopping at a motel at the edge of town. She methodically checked her equipment, communications, weapons, emergency supplies. A phone buzzed. It was a text message from someone identified only as Hawk. 3 more arrivals at motel, professional types, gear in duffel bags. Diane texted back, "Maintain distance, observation only." She returned to studying the maps, her finger tracing the various trails, streams, and natural features surrounding her property. Her cabin sat in the center of a rough circle with specific terrain features marked in red. "Home field advantage," she murmured to herself. Before dawn broke, Diane moved silently through the forest. She wore camouflage clothing and carried a backpack filled with various supplies. With practiced efficiency, she checked and reinforced a series of hidden trail cameras positioned at strategic entry points to her property. At one location, she carefully set a non-lethal trap, a sophisticated tripwire connected to an alarm system. At another, she positioned materials for smoke deployment. Her movements were confident, precise, those of someone with extensive training. As she worked, a deer appeared nearby, watching her curiously before continuing on its way. Diane paused, observing the animal. "This is your home too," she whispered. "I won't let them take it." The rising sun illuminated her face, revealing a woman transformed from the reserved figure at the town meeting into something much more formidable, a predator preparing her territory. With her preparations complete, Diane made her way back toward the cabin, moving like a ghost through the underbrush. The forest around her seemed to embrace her presence, shadows and light working together to conceal her passage. In the distance, through a gap in the trees, she could see the black SUV approaching along the forest road. 5 men were inside now, their expressions serious, focused. They had no idea they were already being hunted. What they saw as her weakness, her isolation in these woods, was actually her greatest strength. This forest had been Jason's playground as a child and, later, the perfect training ground for 2 special operators. Every tree, every ridge, every stream was mapped in her mind. Every shadow was a potential hiding place, every clearing a potential ambush point. These men thought they were coming to scare a defenseless widow. They were about to discover that they had walked into a trap of their own making. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and Diane Reynolds was ready to show them exactly why that was a deadly mistake. Victor Mercer sat at the head of the motel room table, surveying the men he'd assembled. In addition to Cruz and Walker, there were 3 new arrivals. Reese, a former military contractor with a shaved head and a permanent scowl. Dawson, a wiry electronics specialist who hadn't looked up from his laptop since sitting down. And Miller, a mountain of a man whose specialty was making problems disappear. "Let's be clear about our timeline," Victor said, tapping his gold watch. "The county commissioners vote on the final approval in 2 weeks. By then, I need the Reynolds property secured, one way or another." "The recon was solid," Walker reported. "No close neighbors, minimal security, just a woman living alone." Dawson finally looked up from his laptop. "I'm still working on her background. Military spouse, but otherwise unremarkable. Lived in various bases with her husband before he died. No children, no close family I can find." "She turned down $5 million, Victor said. "That's not normal behavior. I want to know why that land is so important to her." Reese studied. The satellite images spread across the table. "The property doesn't seem special, just woods and a cabin. No mineral rights in the area that would be valuable." "There has to be something," Victor insisted. "No one turns down that kind of money out of pure sentiment." Miller, who had been silent until now, spoke in a surprisingly soft voice. "Maybe she just doesn't want to move. Some people get attached to places." Victor shot him a contemptuous look. "Everyone can be motivated to move. We just haven't found the right incentive yet." He stood up and walked to the window, peering through the blinds at the small town beyond. "I want her out by the end of the week. Ideally, we get her signature on these papers." He tossed a folder onto the table. "But if not..." The implication hung in the air. Reese leaned forward. "What are the limits here?" "I don't want to know details," Victor replied coldly. "I just want results. Make it look like an accident if it comes to that. A forest fire, maybe. Tragic, but not uncommon in these parts." Cruz and Walker exchanged uncomfortable glances, but said nothing. "Dawson, keep digging on her background," Victor continued. "The rest of you, I want a detailed plan by morning. We will move tomorrow." 15 miles away, deep in the forest, Diane knelt beside a small stream, filling her canteen. The distant sound of a vehicle engine made her pause. She pulled out her phone and checked the tracking app. The SUV was on the move again, this time headed deeper into the forest, following the dirt road that eventually led to her property. She quickly texted, "Incoming, 5 targets, verify, weapons status." The reply came moments later, confirmed armed handguns plus 1 rifle. Diane slipped the phone back into her pocket and moved swiftly through the underbrush, her footsteps silent on the forest floor. She reached a ridge overlooking the road and settled in to observe. her binoculars revealing the black SUV crawling along the rutted path. "Scouting mission," she murmured to herself. "Just getting the lay of the land." She watched as they stopped at the fork in the road, consulted a map, then turned onto the path that led to her cabin. Time to implement the first stage of her plan. Diane reached for her satellite phone and made a call. "They're moving in sooner than expected," she said when the call connected. "I need you here by nightfall." "Copy that," replied a woman's voice. "Sarah and Mike are already en route. I'll bring the equipment. Tell them to enter through the North Ridge Trail. I've got eyes on the main road." "Will do. Be careful, Diane." "Always am, Liv." Diane ended the call and continued watching as the SUV reached the clearing where her cabin stood. She was positioned, far enough away to remain undetected, but close enough to observe with her high-powered binoculars. They were making a critical mistake, assuming she would be inside, waiting like a trapped animal. Instead, she was out here, in her element, watching their every move. Two men, Cruz and Walker, exited the vehicle first, scanning the surroundings. Then came Reese, clearly in charge of this operation, directing the others with terse hand signals. The big one, Miller, stayed by the SUV, while Dawson set up equipment on the hood, attaching something to a laptop. "Signal jammers," Diane whispered to herself. Smart, but not smart enough. Her satellite communications operated on military frequencies, impervious to commercial jamming equipment. Another advantage they didn't know she had. She watched as Cruz and Walker approached her cabin, moving with what they clearly thought was tactical precision. Their positioning was sloppy, their awareness of their surroundings minimal. They checked the windows first, then Cruz tried the door, locked of course. After a brief consultation with Reese, Cruz produced a slim tool and worked on the lock while Walker kept watch. The door swung open moments later, and the men disappeared. Inside, Diane smiled grimly. The cabin had been prepared for visitors. Inside the cabin, Cruz and Walker moved cautiously through the main room. "The place is clean," Cruz noted, surprised by the minimal, orderly interior. "Military neat. Remember, we're just looking for leverage," Walker reminded him. "Something to convince her to sign the papers." They split up, Cruz taking the small bedroom while Walker searched the main living area. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, casting the interior in shadow, despite the daylight outside. "Not much personal stuff," Cruz called from the bedroom. "Few photos, clothes, basic toiletries." Walker ran his fingers along the bookshelf, noting several volumes on wilderness survival, military history, and, surprisingly, advanced horticulture. A well-worn copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War sat prominently on the coffee table. "Interesting reading taste for a mountain hermit," he muttered. Cruz emerged from the bedroom holding a framed photograph. "Check this out." The photo showed a younger Diane in military uniform, standing beside her husband. Both wore the same unit insignia. "Wait a second," Walker said, taking the frame. "She was in the military too?" Cruz frowned. "Dawson didn't say anything about that." "Maybe he missed it," Walker said, suddenly uneasy. He keyed his radio. "Reese, we found something you should see." Before Reese could respond, Walker noticed a thin wire running along the baseboard, one that shouldn't be there. His eyes followed it to a small device tucked behind the bookshelf. "Cruz, we need to get—" A loud hissing sound interrupted him, as white smoke began pouring from vents in the ceiling. Simultaneously, the cabin's windows and doors slammed shut, metal security shutters deploying from hidden compartments. "What the hell?" Cruz shouted, running to the door and finding it locked. From the outside, "It's a trap!" Outside, Reese watched in alarm as the cabin's exterior transformed, security shutters slamming into place over every potential exit. White smoke began seeping through the seams. "Miller, get the door open!" he shouted. The big man rushed forward with a battering ram from the SUV, but before he could reach the cabin, the ground beneath him gave way. A concealed pit, covered with a carefully disguised false floor, swallowed him to his waist. Though not deep enough to injure him seriously, it effectively immobilized him. Dawson looked up from his equipment, panic evident on his face. The jammers aren't working. Something's overriding them. A moment later, the vehicle's electronics went dead. Lights, engine, everything. Reese reached for his sidearm just as a voice echoed from the trees around them. "This is private property," Diane's voice called out, seemingly from all directions at once. "You were not invited." From her hidden position, Diane watched the chaos unfold through her binoculars. The smoke in the cabin was harmless, a military-grade fog designed to disorient rather than harm. Cruz and Walker would be confused, but uninjured. She had prepared the cabin weeks ago, after the first offer from Mercer's company had turned into thinly veiled threats. The shutters were military surplus, designed to secure buildings in combat zones. The electronic countermeasures had been Sarah's contribution, the work of a genius who had served as their communications specialist in the field. Diane activated the cabin's external speaker system again. "Your men inside the cabin are unharmed. The smoke is non-toxic, however, they'll remain there until I decide to release them." She watched as Reese spun around, trying to locate the source of her voice. "Mrs. Reynolds," he called out, trying to sound calm. "We're just here to talk. This is completely unnecessary." "Armed men breaking into my home don't usually just want to talk," Diane replied. "Tell your man to drop his weapon." Reese hesitated, then signaled Dawson to lower his gun. "We're working for Victor Mercer. He sent us to negotiate." "Negotiate?" Diane's laugh echoed through the forest. "Is that what you call this? $5 million, Mrs. Reynolds? That's his offer. All you have to do is sign the papers." "And if I don't?" Reese's expression hardened. "Then we can't guarantee your safety. Out here all alone." "That's funny," Diane replied. "I was about to say the same thing to you." A new sound cut through the clearing. The low thrum of an approaching helicopter. Reese looked up, relief washing over his face as he spotted the black helicopter emerging from behind the mountain ridge. "That would be Mr. Mercer," he called. "Out. Why don't you come out so we can all discuss this civilly?" What Reese didn't see was the second, smaller helicopter approaching from the opposite direction, flying low enough to avoid conventional radar. Diane watched as Victor's helicopter landed in a clearing about a quarter-mile from the cabin. Perfect. All the players were assembling exactly where she wanted them. She activated her satellite phone. "Liv, what's your ETA?" 10 minutes out. Mike and Sarah are in position on the North Ridge." "Good. Mercer just arrived with backup. Things are about to get interesting. Don't engage until we're in position." "Copy that." Diane slipped through the trees, circling around to observe the new arrivals. Victor Mercer emerged from the helicopter, accompanied by 4 men in tactical gear, private security, by the look of them. More professional than the first group, their weapons held with the confidence of trained operators. "What the hell is going on?" Victor demanded as Reese approached. "Where are Cruz and Walker?" "There's been a complication," Reese explained, gesturing toward the cabin with its shutters deployed. "Mrs. Reynolds was more prepared than we anticipated." Victor's face darkened with anger. "You said this would be simple. One woman living alone in the woods." "She's military," Reese explained. "Both her and her late husband. Same unit, some kind of special forces." Dawson missed it in the background check. "Incompetence," Victor spat. "All of you. Where is she now?" "We don't know. She's using the terrain. Some kind of speaker system. She can see us, but we can't see her." Victor turned to his security team. "Find her, now." The team leader nodded, then dispatched his men in pairs to search the surrounding forest. In a cave, hidden beneath a cliff face half a mile from the cabin, Olivia "Liv" Ramirez unpacked equipment from waterproof cases. A former combat medic who had served with Diane and Jason, she moved with the same efficient precision that characterized all members of their former unit. "Mike, Sarah, check in," she said into her comm unit. North Ridge secured, came Mike Tanner's calm voice. I count 4 new hostiles moving into the forest from the helicopter landing zone. Professional stance and equipment, not amateurs like the first batch. I've got eyes on Mercer and 2 more by the cabin, Sarah Chen added. They're trying to force entry through the shutters. No success so far. Diane, what's your position? Liv asked. Southeast quadrant, moving to intercept 2 hostiles heading your way, Diane replied. These guys are better trained. Ex-military, maybe private contractors. Confirmed, Mike said. I recognize one of them, used to work for Blackwater. Liv finished assembling a compact drone and powered it up. Launching a recon drone now. Will give us overhead visibility. The small drone rose silently into the air, its electric motors barely audible as it ascended above the tree line. Remember the plan. Diane's voice came through clearly. Non-lethal only. We contain them, document everything, and deliver the evidence to the FBI contact in Denver. Copy that, the team responded in unison. Liv smiled as she watched the drone footage on her tablet. It had been 5 years since their last mission together, but the team had fallen back into their old rhythms effortlessly. Some bonds never broke, no matter how much time passed. In the forest, Diane moved like a shadow, tracking the 2 security personnel who had been sent in her direction. Unlike Mercer's initial team, these men moved with discipline, checking their corners and maintaining proper spacing. They were the real deal, which made them more dangerous, but also more predictable. She circled behind them, using the terrain to mask her approach. The forest floor was covered with dry leaves and twigs, but Diane knew how to distribute her weight, how to test each step before committing. This was her domain, where she had trained day after day, preparing for a moment she hoped would never come. The first man paused, raising his fist in the universal hold signal. He'd noticed something, a disturbance in the pattern of the forest, perhaps one of the subtle markers Diane had left to channel intruders exactly where she wanted them. She watched as he whispered to his partner, then pointed to a nearly invisible trail leading up a small rise. The perfect ambush point, if you were the one setting the ambush. As they cautiously ascended the rise, Diane circled behind, cutting off their retreat. At the top of the rise, the men found a small clearing containing nothing but a tree stump with a satellite phone placed conspicuously on top. "What the hell?" one muttered, approaching cautiously. The phone rang, startling both men. After a moment's hesitation, the lead man picked it up. "Hello." "You're trespassing on private property," Diane said, her voice calm. "This is your only warning." "Mrs. Reynolds, Mr. Mercer just wants to talk business," the man replied, signaling his partner to search for her. "No one needs to get hurt here." "I agree. That's why you and your friend are going to drop your weapons and walk back to the helicopter. Tell Mercer I'll meet him in town tomorrow, in public, with my lawyer present." The man laughed. "That's not how this works, lady. Look down," Diane instructed. Confused, the man glanced at his feet, noticing for the first time the thin wire surrounding the clearing, a perimeter he and his partner had unwittingly crossed. "That's a modified Claymore ignition system," Diane explained. "Not attached. 2 explosives, but to compressed air canisters containing a military-grade adhesive foam. One step across that wire, and you'll both be immobilized for the next 8 hours until the solvent can be applied." "Your choice." The men exchanged glances, weighing their options. "Smart choice would be to walk away," Diane continued. "This isn't the kind of money worth dying for." The lead man sighed, then slowly placed his weapon on the ground. His partner, after a moment's hesitation, did the same. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he warned, as they backed away from their discarded weapons. "Mercer doesn't lose. Ever." "There's a first time for everything," Diane replied. As the men retreated down the hill, Diane emerged from her hiding spot and collected their weapons. 2 down, many more to go. But she had made her point. These men were professionals. They understood odds and tactical disadvantages. The message would spread to the others. She was not prey. This was her hunting ground, and the rules of engagement were entirely hers to define. Victor Mercer paced the clearing, his expensive shoes gathering mud with each step. The situation was spiraling beyond his control, and nothing infuriated him more than loss of control. His security team's radio crackled with the news that Jensen and Parker had been disarmed and were returning to base. Disarmed? By one woman? Victor snarled. The security team leader, Sullivan, a former Delta Force operator with a reputation for efficiency, shook his head. "Sir, we're dealing with someone with extensive training, and she's not alone." "What do you mean, not alone?" Victor demanded. Sullivan pointed to the small drone now visible, hovering at the edge of their visual range. "That's military-grade surveillance equipment. And based on the radio chatter we've intercepted, she has at least 3 other operators. In these woods," Reese approached cautiously, aware of Victor's darkening mood. "The technical team is still working on the cabin shutters. Cruz and Walker are trapped inside, but responding to radio checks. They're unharmed." Victor rubbed his temples, feeling a migraine threatening. This was supposed to be simple. A widow living alone in the woods, refusing to sell. Pressure her, scare her, get her signature. How did it turn into a tactical nightmare? "Sir," Sullivan said, his voice steady, "I recommend we pull back and reassess. Whoever these people are, they've prepared this terrain extensively. Fighting on the ground of their choosing puts us at a significant disadvantage." "I'm not leaving," Victor snapped. "Do you understand what's at stake here? The resort deal closes in 2 weeks. If we don't have this property secured, I lose everything. Contracts, investors, political leverage, all gone." He took a deep breath, composing himself. When he spoke again, his voice was dangerously calm. "Contact our friends at the sheriff's department. Tell them we've located a dangerous militia compound in the forest. Get tactical support out here." Sullivan frowned. "Sir, falsely reporting—" "I'm not paying you to question my decisions," Victor cut him off. "I'm paying you to implement them, make the call." As Sullivan moved away to comply, Victor turned to Dawson, who was still working frantically on his equipment. "What about the jammers? Can you block their communications?" "I'm trying," Dawson replied, frustration evident in his voice. "But they're using military frequencies and encryption protocols. This is beyond commercial jamming capabilities," Victor cursed under his breath. The $5 million he'd offered Reynolds was a pittance compared to what he stood to gain from the resort development, or lose if it fell through. He'd leveraged everything on this deal, including funds that weren't strictly his to use. Failure wasn't an option. He pulled out his phone to make a call, then remembered the jammers would block regular cell service. Instead, he walked briskly to his helicopter and used its satellite phone. "It's Mercer," he said when the call connected. "I need the special asset team." "Yes, the contractors from Sarajevo. No, I don't care about the cost. Send them in." From her position on the North Ridge, Sarah Chen watched the helicopter clearing through her high-powered binoculars. A former intelligence specialist, Sarah had an uncanny ability to read lips, a skill that was proving useful now as she observed Victor's conversation in the helicopter. "Diane, are you on comms?" she asked quietly. "Go ahead," came the immediate response. "Mercer's escalating. He just called in what he referred to as contractors from Sarajevo. Based on that reference, we could be looking at Axis Security Group. Bad news if I'm right. They're essentially mercenaries with a reputation for extreme measures." "Copy that. How many and what timeline?" Sarah continued observing. "Can't tell for sure, but based on his body language, we're talking hours, not days." "Understood. Mike, what's your status?" Mike Tanner's voice came through clearly. "I've located the sheriff's vehicle approaching from the main road. 2 deputies, lights but no sirens. They're about 10 minutes out. Liv? Diane asked. Drone shows 2 more of Mercer's security team approaching your position from the southwest, Liv reported. They're moving more cautiously after what happened to their colleagues. Diane considered this information. The situation was escalating faster than anticipated, but they had prepared for multiple contingencies. Sarah, maintain observation on Mercer. Mike, intercept the deputies before they reach Mercer. We need to give them our side of the story first. I'll handle the approaching security team. Roger that, her team responded in unison. Diane moved swiftly through the forest, circling to approach the security team from behind. These woods had been her training ground for 5 years. Every ridge, ravine, and game trail committed to memory. While her opponents fumbled through unfamiliar terrain, she glided through it like a ghost. The 2 security operatives were moving slowly, checking their surroundings with professional diligence. They were good, but they were fighting on her territory, against an opponent they couldn't see. Diane lifted her radio. Liv, I need a distraction. Northeast quadrant, grid reference Charlie 7. On it. Moments later, a series of small explosions erupted in the distance, harmless noisemakers designed to draw attention. As expected, the security team paused, then adjusted their course toward the sound. Diane smiled grimly. Predictable. She paralleled their new path, using the terrain to stay hidden while closing the distance between them. When they reached a narrow ravine, she was waiting. The first man stepped cautiously into the ravine, his partner covering him from the edge. Exactly where Diane wanted them to be. She pressed a button on a small remote, and nets dropped from the trees above, ensnaring both men before they could react. Specially designed tactical nets, weighted and reinforced, another tool from their military days, repurposed for this defensive operation. "What the hell?" the first man shouted, struggling. Against the heavy netting, Diane emerged from cover, keeping a safe distance. "Your weapons. Toss them aside carefully." The men exchanged glances, then reluctantly complied, pushing their firearms out through gaps in the netting. "Mrs. Reynolds, I presume," said the one who appeared to be in charge. "You have 2 choices," Diane stated flatly. "Option 1, I leave you here, and your boss eventually finds you. Option 2, I release you now, you walk back to the helicopter, and you leave my property. You don't understand what you're getting into," the man warned. "Mr. Mercer doesn't take no for an answer." "Neither do I," Diane replied. "And while Mr. Mercer may be dangerous in boardrooms and back alleys, this is my world. Out here I make the rules." She approached cautiously and cut a small opening in the net, trapping the lead operative. "Take this as a professional courtesy from one soldier to another. Walk away. Whatever he's paying you, it's not worth it." The man studied her face, noting the unwavering determination in her eyes. After a moment, he nodded. "We'll go. But Mercer's bringing in contractors from Sarajevo. You know what that means." "I do," Diane acknowledged. "All the more reason for you to be elsewhere when they arrive." She stepped back, allowing the man to extricate himself from the net. He then helped free his partner, both of them watching Diane warily. "Your firearms will be at the base of the large oak tree, a quarter-mile east of the helicopter landing zone," Diane informed them. "Unloaded, of course." The men nodded in grudging respect before departing. Diane waited until they were out of sight before contacting her team. 2 more neutralized and departing. "Mike, what's your status with the deputies?" Sheriff's Deputy James Harlow was having a confusing day. What had started as a routine patrol had turned into a wild goose chase when they'd received a call about a potential illegal militia compound in the Reynolds property area. Now he and his partner were parked on a Forest Service road, speaking with a man who had identified himself as Mike Tanner, a friend of Diane Reynolds. "Let me get this straight," Arlo said, trying to process what he was hearing. "Victor Mercer, the resort developer, has hired armed men to intimidate Mrs. Reynolds into selling her property." "That's correct," Mike replied calmly. We have evidence of trespassing, breaking and entering, and armed intimidation. Mrs. Reynolds called us, her friends, for help when Mercer's men started surveilling her cabin. Deputy Carla Rodriguez frowned. Why didn't she call us? Mike raised an eyebrow. Would that be the same sheriff's department that's received substantial donations from Mercer's development company over the past year? The same department whose sheriff was photographed golfing with Mercer last month? The deputies exchanged uncomfortable glances. Look, Mike continued, handing them a USB drive. This contains surveillance footage of Mercer's men trespassing on Reynolds' property, carrying weapons, and attempting forced entry to her cabin. There's also audio of Mercer explicitly threatening Mrs. Reynolds at the town hall meeting yesterday. Rodriguez took the drive, her expression troubled. If what you're saying is true, we need to call in backup and— That won't be necessary, Mike interrupted. Mrs. Reynolds and her friends have the situation contained. No one has been injured. We're simply documenting everything for legal purposes. Sir, if there are armed individuals on private property, Harlow began. The only armed trespassers are Mercer's men, Mike pointed out. Mrs. Reynolds and her friends are legally on her property, defending it from intruders. Check your jurisdiction. And Castle Doctrine laws, Deputy. Rodriguez sighed. This is above our pay grade. We need to contact the sheriff. By all means, Mike agreed. But I suggest you review that evidence first. Mercer has already called in a false report about a militia compound to draw you in. Be careful about whose word you take at face value. The deputies conferred quietly, then Harlow nodded. We'll review the evidence before proceeding, but tell Mrs. Reynolds we'll need her statement soon. Understood, Mike replied. She'll be available once the current situation is resolved. In the meantime, I recommend establishing a perimeter on the main access road. For public safety. As the deputies returned to their vehicle, Mike contacted Diane. Deputies are standing down for now. They're reviewing our evidence, but they've called the sheriff, so we're on a timeline. Good work, Diane responded. Get back to your position. Things are about to get complicated. In the cave headquarters, Liv monitored the drone footage while coordinating communications. The survival bunker, built by Jason and Diane years ago as both a training exercise and a precaution, was proving its worth today. Solar-powered batteries provided electricity for their equipment, and the natural rock formation offered protection. From surveillance, Sarah's voice came through the comms. Mercer's getting desperate. He just fired Reese for incompetence and put Sullivan in charge of all security operations. That tracks, Liv replied, watching the drone feed. Sullivan's reorganizing the perimeter, pulling back to defensible positions. He's smarter than Reese, recognizes they're at a tactical disadvantage in the forest. What's our next move? Sarah asked. Hold positions. Diane's voice joined the conversation. Cruz and Walker are still secured in the cabin. Sullivan has 4 men left, plus Dawson and Miller. Mercer's helicopter pilot makes 8 total hostiles currently on site. And the Sarajevo contractors? Mike asked. ETA unknown, but we need to assume they're inbound, Diane replied. Liv, what supplies do we have at the secondary location? Liv consulted a digital inventory on her tablet. Full tactical loadout, non-lethal and defensive options only as planned. Smoke, flashbangs, tasers, nets and restraints, plus emergency medical for all contingencies. Good. We stick to the plan. Contain, document and report. No casualties if we can avoid it, Diane instructed. Remember, this isn't just about my property anymore. We need enough evidence to bring Mercer down for good. Sarah's voice came through with renewed urgency. Movement at the helicopter. Mercer's on his satellite phone again, looking agitated. Based on what I can read, oh, this is interesting. He mentioned something about contingency funds and creative accounting. Sounds like he's got financial problems if this deal falls. You through? Diane considered this new information. That explains the escalation. He's desperate, which makes him dangerous. Sarah, keep watching him. If he's making multiple calls, he might reveal something we can use. Copy that, Sarah replied. One more thing, Diane added. If the Sarajevo contractors arrive, we switch to Plan Delta. They won't follow the same rules of engagement as Sullivan's team. The team acknowledged her instructions, each understanding the gravity of the situation. What had started as a defense of Diane's property had evolved into something more significant, exposing a corrupt developer willing to use violence to get what he wanted. Victor ended his call, fighting the urge to throw the satellite phone against the helicopter's interior. His financial backers were getting nervous, demanding results or threatening to pull out. The resort development wasn't just a business opportunity, it was financial salvation. Without it, the house of cards he'd built would collapse, taking his reputation, wealth, and freedom with it. He stepped out of the helicopter to find Sullivan waiting with an update. Sir, 2 more of my men have returned. They were neutralized by Reynolds and her team, non-violently but effectively. Victor's patience snapped. Are you telling me that a team of ex-military contractors can't handle one widow and a few of her friends? Sullivan's expression remained professional, but his tone cooled. Sir, with respect, we're dealing with highly trained individuals who have extensively prepared this terrain. They have surveillance, communication superiority, and intimate knowledge of the environment. A direct assault would result in casualties. On our side. Then what do you suggest? Victor demanded. A strategic withdrawal, regroup, gather intelligence, return with appropriate resources and planning. Victor shook his head vehemently. Not an option. The Axis team will be here within 3 hours. They don't play by conventional rules. Sullivan's expression darkened. Sir, bringing in those contractors changes the nature of this operation significantly. My team signed on for intimidation and security, not whatever Axis might do. Your contract includes a confidentiality clause and completion bonus, Victor reminded him coldly. See it through or deal with the consequences. Their conversation was interrupted by Dawson, who approached with his laptop. Sir, I've got something. The jammers picked up a brief transmission from inside the cabin. Crews managed to get a message out. What did he say? Victor asked. They're unharmed, but locked down. The cabin has some kind of automated security system. But here's the interesting part. He caught a glimpse of documents before the smoke deployed. Apparently, Reynolds has evidence of financial irregularities in your development company. Something about offshore accounts and diverted investor funds. Victor went very still. That's impossible. Those records are secured. Dawson shrugged. Just reporting what Cruz said, sir. Victor turned away, mind racing. How could Reynolds have obtained his private financial records unless Jason Reynolds, Special Forces, access to intelligence resources? What if he had investigated Victor's company before his death, perhaps suspecting the plans for development even then? The stakes had just risen exponentially. This was no longer just about a piece of property. If Reynolds had evidence of his financial maneuvers, everything was at risk, including his freedom. Sullivan, Victor said, his voice now deadly calm. Prepare your men. When the Axis team arrives, we move on the cabin with everything we've got. I want Reynolds and her friends neutralized, and I want any documents in that cabin secured. Sullivan hesitated. Sir, neutralized can be interpreted. I don't care how you interpret it, Victor snapped. Just get it done. As Sullivan walked away to brief his remaining men, Victor stared at the forest surrounding them. Somewhere out there, Diane Reynolds was watching, planning, perhaps even listening. For the first time in his business career, Victor felt like the prey rather than the predator. It was not a feeling he intended to tolerate for long. Diane crouched in her observation post, watching the activity at the helicopter clearing through her binoculars. The conversation between Victor and Sullivan had been too distant to overhear, but their body language told her enough. Escalation was imminent. She activated her comm unit. Team, status report. North Ridge clear. Mike responded. Deputies have established a roadblock at the main forest access point about 2 miles from our position. Still monitoring Mercer, Sarah added. He's agitated, making more calls. Sullivan is briefing his remaining men. Looks like they're preparing for something. Drone shows no new approaching vehicles, Liv reported. But we have clear skies, which means potential aerial assets could be inbound. Diane processed this information, mentally reviewing their options. Their strategy had been to contain the situation, document illegal activities, and force a legal resolution. But if Victor was bringing in mercenaries known for extreme tactics, the situation could deteriorate rapidly. Listen carefully, she instructed. We've got a new objective. Sarah, your observations suggest Mercer is financially desperate if this deal falls through, correct? Affirmative. Based on his conversations, he's leveraged significantly. This isn't just a development opportunity for him, it's financial survival. Then we hit him where it really hurts, Diane decided. Mike, retrieve package Echo from the North Cache and bring it to the cave. Liv, prepare the secure uplink to our FBI contact. Sarah, maintain observation, but be ready to move if the situation changes. What about you? Liv asked. I'm going to give Mr. Mercer something to think about, Diane replied. A reminder that he's not the only one who can escalate a situation. She ended the transmission and reached into her pack, removing a small case containing specialized equipment. As she assembled the components, Diane reflected on how different her life had become from what she'd once imagined. She and Jason had bought this land as a refuge, a place to heal after their years of service. Now it has become a battleground once again. But this time she was fighting for something that was truly hers, not for a mission assigned by distant commanders, but for her home, her peace, and justice that was long overdue. With the device assembled, Diane moved through the forest toward her next position. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows that provided perfect concealment for someone who knew how to use them. And Diane Reynolds had become a master of shadows. Time to show Victor Mercer exactly what kind of widow he had chosen to threaten. Sheriff Bill Haynes stepped out of his department SUV at the Forest Road checkpoint, his weathered face set in a deep frown. Deputies Harlow and Rodriguez snapped to attention as he approached. What's this I hear about Victor Mercer and armed contractors on the Reynolds property? He demanded, adjusting his hat against the afternoon sun. Deputy Rodriguez handed him the USB drive. Sir, we have video evidence of armed individuals trespassing. On Reynolds' land, they've attempted forced entry into her cabin and made threats against her. The sheriff's frown deepened. And where did this evidence come from? A friend of Mrs. Reynolds, Harlow explained. Name's Mike Tanner, military background. Says Mrs. Reynolds called friends for help when Mercer's men started surveilling her property. Friends? What kind of friends? The sheriff asked, suspicion evident in his tone. Former military, from what we gather, Rodriguez replied. They're on her property legally, according to Tanner. Sheriff Haynes took the USB drive but didn't look at it. Instead, he gazed up the forest road, his expression troubled. I spoke with Victor this morning. He mentioned potential trouble with finalizing the Reynolds purchase, said nothing about sending armed men. Sir, Rodriguez ventured carefully, maybe we should review the evidence before proceeding. The sheriff nodded reluctantly. Let's see what we're dealing with. He returned to his vehicle and plugged the drive into his laptop. The deputies watched as his expression shifted from skepticism to concern while viewing the footage. After several minutes, he emerged. His demeanor changed. Call for backup. I want a perimeter established around that entire section of forest. No one in or out without my direct authorization. Sir? Harlow questioned, surprised by the shift. That wasn't just intimidation on that video, the sheriff explained grimly. I counted at least 6 firearms, including what looked like modified military equipment, and Mercer himself was present, giving orders. He shook his head. I've known Victor for years, supported his projects, but this crosses every line. What? About Mrs. Reynolds and her friends? Rodriguez asked. We maintain the perimeter and wait, the sheriff decided. Based on this footage, they're defending private property against armed intruders. Legally, they're within their rights. But I want this contained before anybody gets hurt. He reached for his radio. And get me the state police on the line. This might be beyond our jurisdiction if those contractors Tanner mentioned are who I think they are. In the forest, Diane moved silently toward her destination, a ridgeline overlooking both the helicopter clearing and the cabin area. From this vantage point, she could monitor movements between the two locations while remaining hidden in the thick undergrowth. Her satellite phone vibrated. It was a text from Mike. Package Echo retrieved, en route to cave. Package Echo, a collection of financial documents that Jason had compiled years ago, tracking Victor Mercer's business dealings. At the time, Jason had been investigating rumors of money laundering through resort developments in remote areas. He'd never completed the investigation, called away on his final mission, but he'd secured the evidence he'd gathered. Diane had continued the work after his death, connecting more dots as Mercer's Blackridge resort plan took shape. The evidence wasn't conclusive yet, but combined with whatever desperate moves Mercer might make today, it could be enough to trigger a federal investigation. She reached the ridgeline and settled into a natural blind formed by fallen logs and dense foliage. Through her binoculars, she observed Sullivan positioning his remaining men in a defensive perimeter around the helicopter. "Sarah, do you copy?" she whispered into her comm. "Go ahead," came the immediate response. "Any update on Mercer's communications?" "He's made 3 calls in the last 30 minutes, Sarah reported. Based on lip reading and body language, he's facing resistance from his financial backers. One call ended with him throwing the phone against the helicopter seat. Desperate. "Men make mistakes," Diane murmured. "Keep watching." She shifted her attention to her satellite phone, sending a secure message to a contact listed only as Ranger. The message contained GPS coordinates, and a brief situation report followed. "By contingency, Alpha requested." The reply came moments later. "Alpha confirmed, ETA 90 minutes. Diane allowed herself a small smile. "Contingency Alpha. Emergency extraction if the situation deteriorated beyond their ability to contain it." A former teammate now working with federal law enforcement would arrive with official backup, but they needed to hold their position until then. Her contemplation was interrupted by movement at the helicopter clearing. A new figure had emerged from the tree line. A local man Diane recognized as Charlie Weber, one of the town's hunting guides. "Liv, are you seeing this?" Diane asked into her comm. "Affirmative. Drone has visual of Weber approaching Mercer's position. Charlie Weber, known locally as a skilled tracker and guide, familiar with every inch of these woods. If Mercer had hired him, the tactical dynamics could shift significantly." "I need audio on that conversation," Diane said. "Working on it," Liv replied. "Redirecting the drone now." Charlie Weber felt distinctly uncomfortable as he approached the cluster of armed men surrounding the sleek helicopter. This wasn't what he'd signed up for when Mayor Walsh called, asking him to guide some resort investors on the old logging trails. Victor Mercer stepped forward, offering a handshake that Charlie reluctantly accepted. "Mr. Weber, thank you for coming on such short notice. The mayor speaks highly of your knowledge of these woods." "The mayor said you needed a guide for some investors," Charlie replied cautiously. "Didn't mention all the hardware." He nodded. "Toward the visible firearms. Security precaution," Victor dismissed with a wave. "We've had some territorial disputes with the property owner. Nothing serious." Charlie wasn't convinced. He'd known Diane Reynolds for years, not well, but they shared a mutual respect as people who understood the forest. She'd never caused trouble for anyone who respected boundaries. "What exactly do you need from me?" he asked. Victor spread a map across the hood of a vehicle. "We need alternative approaches to this cabin, routes that wouldn't be obvious to someone familiar with the main trails." Charlie studied the map, recognizing the Reynolds property. "Those are game trails mostly, narrow, rough terrain. Not suitable for vehicles, but accessible on foot? Sure, if you know what you're looking for." Victor pointed to specific areas around the cabin. "We need access points here, here, and here. Preferably covered approaches that provide concealment." The request was raising red flags for Charlie. This wasn't about investment touring. This was tactical planning. "Mind telling me what this is really about? I don't want any part of something illegal." Victor's expression hardened momentarily before he forced a smile. "Nothing illegal, Mr. Weber. Mrs. Reynolds has some documents that belong to my company. Business records that were inappropriately accessed. We're simply trying to recover them with minimal confrontation." Charlie wasn't buying it, but before he could respond, Sullivan approached with a satellite phone. "Sir, the Axis team has landed at the private airstrip. They'll be here within 40 minutes. Victor nodded, then turned back to Charlie. "Time is of the essence, Mr. Weber. $10,000 for an hour of your time and expertise. Cash." Charlie hesitated. That kind of money would cover his mortgage for months, but something felt very wrong about this situation. He glanced at the armed men, the sophisticated equipment, the tension evident in everyone's posture. "I think I'll pass," he said finally. "These woods can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing, or if you're doing something you shouldn't be." Victor's facade of friendliness vanished. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Weber. This isn't a request you can decline." Sullivan moved subtly, his hand shifting toward his holstered weapon. The message was clear. Charlie swallowed hard, realizing he'd walked into something much more dangerous than he'd anticipated. "All right," he conceded. "I'll show you the trails, but I want it on record that I'm being coerced." "Duly noted," Victor replied coldly. "Now, where do we start?" From her vantage point, Diane watched the interaction through her binoculars. The drone hadn't been able to capture audio clearly, but the body language told her enough. Charlie was being coerced into helping Mercer's team. "Liv, I need a distraction at the helicopter clearing," she said into her comm. "Something to separate Charlie from the group." "On it," Liv replied. "Remote charges set at grid reference Delta 9, ready to detonate on your signal." Delta 9? An old logging site, about a quarter-mile from the helicopter clearing. The charges were non-explosive, designed to create noise and smoke rather than destruction. "Execute in 30 seconds, Diane instructed, already moving swiftly through the undergrowth toward a position that would allow her to intercept Charlie. The forest erupted with sound as the charges detonated, sending birds scattering into the sky. From her new position, Diane watched as Sullivan immediately organized a response team, directing them toward the disturbance. Charlie was left with Victor and 2 guards, better odds, but still challenging. Diane needed to level the playing field further. She reached into her pack and removed a small canister, a military-grade smoke grenade modified for minimal environmental impact. She calculated wind direction, then rolled it carefully down the slope toward the clearing. Thick white smoke billowed upward, engulfing the area around Victor's position. Shouts of confusion echoed through the trees as visibility dropped to near zero. Diane moved quickly, using the smoke as cover to approach. Charlie and his now disoriented guards. The first guard never saw her coming. A quick strike to a pressure point on his neck, and he crumpled to the ground, unconscious but unharmed. The second guard fired blindly into the smoke, his shots going wide. Diane circled behind him, using the sound of his own panicked breathing to pinpoint his location. A swift kick to the back of his knee brought him down, followed by a precisely delivered sedative injection, another tool from her military days, repurposed for this defense. "Charlie!" she called softly, finding him crouched beside a vehicle, wisely staying low. "It's Diane Reynolds. Come with me if you want out of this mess." He looked up, relief washing over his face as he recognized her. "Diane! What the hell is going on? No time to explain fully. Mercer's trying to force me off my land. These men are hired muscle." She offered her hand. "Trust me?" Charlie glanced at the unconscious guards, then back at Diane. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded and took her hand. "Lead the way." They slipped away through the smoke, Diane guiding them along a path invisible to untrained eyes, a narrow game trail that wound through dense underbrush, offering perfect concealment. "I didn't know what I was walking into," Charlie explained. As they moved, Mayor Walsh called, said some investors needed a guide. "Next thing I know, I'm surrounded by armed men talking about assault approaches to your cabin. It's not your fault," Diane assured him. "Mercer's desperate. The resort deal is his financial lifeline, apparently. Those men he's bringing in, the Axis team, they sounded dangerous." "They are," Diane confirmed grimly, "which is why we need to get you to safety. My friends and I can handle ourselves, but you shouldn't be caught in the crossfire." They reached a small clearing where Mike was waiting with an ATV hidden under camouflage netting. "Charlie," Mike acknowledged with a nod. "Good to see you made it out." "Mike's going to take you to the Forest Service Road," Diane explained. "Sheriffs, deputies have established a perimeter. Tell them everything you saw and heard at Mercer's camp." Charlie hesitated. "What about you?" "I'm staying to protect my property," Diane replied simply, "and to gather enough evidence to put Mercer away. For good." Charlie studied her face, seeing something there he hadn't noticed in their previous casual encounters, the steel resolve of a trained warrior. "You're not just a widow who moved to the woods for solitude, are you?" Diane smiled slightly. "Let's just say there's more to most people's stories than meets the eye." After Charlie departed with Mike, Diane contacted Sarah and Liv. "Charlie's safely extracted. What's the situation with the helicopter?" "Chaos," Sarah reported. "Sullivan's men returned from investigating the explosion to find the two guards down and both you and Charlie gone. Mercer's furious. The drone shows them regrouping," Liv added. "They're abandoning the perimeter strategy. Looks like they're preparing for a direct assault on the cabin instead. They think we're all inside," Diane reasoned. "Good. Let them focus on a hardened target while we maintain mobility." She checked her watch. "Axis team ETA? Based on their departure from the airstrip, approximately 20 minutes, Liv calculated. And our backup? Still tracking at 90 minutes out." Diane considered their options. The Axis contractors would transform the situation from intimidation to potentially lethal force. Their reputation for brutal efficiency was well earned. "Mike, status?" she asked as she began moving toward a secondary position. "Charlie's with the deputies," Mike reported. "I'm returning to the North Ridge position now." "Change of plans," Diane instructed. "Rendezvous at the cave instead. Bring the long-range equipment. If these Axis contractors are who I think they are, we need to adjust our approach." Victor Mercer was reaching the limits of his patience. The smoke had cleared, revealing two of his guards unconscious and the local guide missing. Sullivan was organizing what remained of his security team, but their effectiveness had been systematically dismantled throughout the day. How did one woman and a few friends neutralize professional security operators? He demanded, pacing alongside the helicopter. "Not one woman and a few friends," Sullivan corrected grimly. "Based on their tactics, equipment, and coordination, we're dealing with a trained special operations team, likely the same unit her husband served with." Victor stopped pacing. "You're saying I'm up against a military unit?" "Former military," Sullivan clarified. "But yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. They're using non-lethal tactics so far, which, is the only reason none of my men are dead. They have superior position, superior intelligence, and superior terrain knowledge. Victor's satellite phone rang, interrupting their conversation. "Mercer," he answered sharply. "Mr. Mercer, this is Ronald Hayes with Eastbrook Investment Partners." The voice belonged to Victor's primary financial backer. "We've been reviewing the Blackridge Resort prospectus again, and some concerning issues have come to light." Victor turned away from Sullivan, lowering his voice. "What issues?" "Discrepancies in the land acquisition reporting," Hayes explained. "Specifically, documentation indicating all necessary properties were secured when, in fact, the Reynolds parcel remains unacquired. That's a material misrepresentation, Mr. Mercer." Victor's mouth went dry. "A minor oversight that's being corrected as we speak. There's also the matter of the preliminary environmental impact study," Hayes continued. "Our legal team has discovered it was performed by a company that doesn't appear to exist beyond a postal box in the Cayman Islands. Care to explain?" "Look, Ron, these are administrative details that—" "No, Victor, these are potential securities. Violations," Hayes cut him off coldly. "Eastbrook is exercising its due diligence clause. We're withdrawing our funding commitment pending a full audit." "You can't do that," Victor exploded. "The closing is in 2 weeks. Without your funding, the entire project collapses." "Perhaps you should have considered that before submitting fraudulent documentation," Hayes replied. "Goodbye, Mr. Mercer. Our attorneys will be in touch." The line went dead, leaving Victor staring at the phone in disbelief. How had they discovered the falsified environmental study? That document had been carefully crafted to avoid exactly this kind of scrutiny, unless— Reynolds, the documents in her cabin, the research her husband had been conducting before his death. Somehow she must have forwarded evidence to his investors. Victor's shock transformed into cold fury. This was no longer about the resort development. Reynolds had just destroyed his career, his reputation, possibly his freedom, if the fraud allegations triggered a federal investigation. Sullivan approached cautiously, noting the dangerous change in Victor's demeanor. "Sir, the Axis team has arrived. They're waiting for a briefing at the forest entrance." Victor nodded slowly. "Tell them the mission parameters have changed. I don't care about the documents anymore. I want Reynolds and her team neutralized, permanently." Sullivan's expression revealed his discomfort. "Sir, that's not what my team signed on for." "Your team has proven surprisingly ineffective," Victor snapped. "The Axis contractors will handle it from here." He fixed Sullivan with a cold stare. "You have a choice, Captain. Continue under the revised mission parameters, or consider your contract terminated without the completion bonus or references." Sullivan held Victor's gaze for a long moment before responding. "My team will secure the helicopter and maintain communication support. That's all." "Fine," Victor conceded. "Just stay out of the way." As Sullivan walked away, Victor felt a cold certainty settling over him. Reynolds had pushed him past the point of rational business concerns. Now it was personal, and he would make sure she understood exactly what happened to people who crossed. Victor Mercer. In the cave headquarters, Diane studied the topographic display showing the positions of Mercer's forces. The drone had captured clear images of the Axis team's arrival. 6 men, with the hardened expressions and efficient movements of experienced mercenaries. "I recognized 2 of them," Sarah commented, examining the footage. "Balkan conflict specialists, not officially affiliated with any legitimate security contractor. They're ghost operators, men who don't officially exist." "Their equipment is high-end," Mike observed. "Military-grade weapons with aftermarket modifications. These aren't just intimidation specialists like Sullivan's team." Liv looked up from her communication equipment. "Our FBI contact confirms they're en route, but we're on our own for at least an hour." Diane considered their options. The original plan had been to contain and document, maintaining defensive positions until law enforcement could intervene. But with the Axis team's arrival, the calculus had changed dramatically. We need to adjust our strategy, she decided. These men won't hesitate to use lethal force. We need to create distance between them and the cabin. You're proposing a tactical retreat? Mike asked. A fighting withdrawal, Diane clarified. We abandon the cabin as a fixed position and use mobile tactics in the forest. Make them chase shadows while we document their illegal activities. Sarah nodded approvingly. Classic guerrilla strategy. Fight on our terms, not theirs. Exactly, Diane agreed. Liv, you maintain drone surveillance and communications from here. Mike, you and Sarah take the high ground positions here and here. She indicated 2 ridgelines on the map. I'll lead them away from the cabin toward the eastern ravine. That's the most dangerous position, Mike pointed out. It's my land, Diane replied simply. My responsibility. The team began gathering their equipment, non-lethal defensive tools, communications gear, and documentation devices. Years of operating in hostile territories had taught them to travel light and adapt quickly. As they prepared to move out, Diane paused by the cave entrance, gazing toward her cabin in the distance. That small structure represented everything she and Jason had dreamed. Of a peaceful life after years of service, a place to heal and grow old together. Now it might become collateral damage in a developer's desperate gambit, but the cabin was just wood and nails. The land, the forest that had become her sanctuary, that was worth fighting for. And unlike Mercer and his hired guns, Diane knew. Every tree, every stream, every hidden path. They thought they were hunting a defenseless widow. They were about to discover they were the prey, not the predator in this forest. Remember, she told her team as they prepared to head out, our objective is to contain and document, not eliminate. These men are just tools. Mercer is the real target. With that, they dispersed into the forest, moving like ghosts among the trees as the afternoon shadows lengthened. The battle for Blackridge Forest was entering its most dangerous phase. The Axis team leader, a man known only as Voss, studied the forest surrounding Diane's cabin through specialized thermal optics. His weathered face betrayed no emotion as he analyzed the tactical situation. Beside him, his 5-man team waited in disciplined silence, their equipment marking them as something far more dangerous than conventional security. No thermal signatures in the cabin, Voss noted, lowering the device, but the security shutters are still deployed. Victor paced impatiently behind them. They must be inside. Where else would they be? Voss turned to him with cold efficiency. In the forest. Watching us right now, most likely. Then find them, Victor demanded. Voss shared a look with his team that spoke volumes about their opinion of civilian clients. Mr. Mercer, based on everything we've observed and the intelligence provided by Sullivan's team, we're dealing with trained special operators who know this terrain intimately. Rushing in blindly would be inadvisable. That's why I'm paying you, Victor snapped. You're supposed to be specialists in dealing with exactly this kind of situation. We are, Voss confirmed calmly. Which is why we're going to do this methodically. He turned to his team. Carroll, Maddox, establish a communication interception perimeter. Ryden, get the drone up for aerial reconnaissance. Lennox, Fisher, prepare for cabin breach once we've confirmed the situation. As his men dispersed to their tasks, Voss turned back to Victor. We'll locate your targets, Mr. Mercer, but first, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Sullivan mentioned the woman's husband was Special Forces. What unit? Victor shrugged. Some classified operation. What does it matter? It matters, Voss replied with thinly veiled impatience, because different units have different tactical signatures. Knowing who trained them tells me how they'll think, how they'll move, what strategies they'll employ. Victor pulled out his Phone and call Dawson. Get me everything you can find on Jason Reynolds' military service. Now. While they waited, Voss continued his methodical preparation, checking equipment and studying the terrain. Unlike Sullivan's team, who had approached the situation as a simple intimidation job, Voss recognized the signs of a professionally prepared defensive position. The non-lethal traps, the strategic use of terrain, the disciplined communication, protocols, all pointed to a trained team with extensive experience. Dawson arrived minutes later, laptop in hand. "I've been digging deeper into Jason Reynolds' background," he reported. "Most of his service record is classified, but I found mentions of Task Force Sierra in some publicly available commendations." Voss went very still. "Task Force Sierra? You're certain?" Dawson nodded. "That's what the documents indicated." Voss turned to Victor, his expression suddenly grave. "Mr. Mercer, you failed to mention we're up against Sierra operators." "What does that mean?" Victor demanded. "It means," Voss replied coldly, "that you've significantly underrepresented the nature of this engagement. Task Force Sierra specialized in asymmetric warfare, counterintelligence, and deep cover operations in hostile territory. They were ghost operators, the best of the best." "So what? They're still just people, former military playing at being soldiers in the woods," Voss almost smiled. "No, Mr. Mercer, if Reynolds and her team are Sierra veterans, they aren't playing at anything. They're using only a fraction of their capabilities so far." He studied the forest with newfound respect. "The fact that they've neutralized Sullivan's entire team without a single casualty tells me they're exercising extreme restraint." "Can you handle them or not?" Victor pressed. "We can," Voss assured him. "But the parameters and the price have just changed significantly." Half a mile away, Diane moved silently through the forest, carefully placing false trails and misleading signs for the Axis team to follow. She'd operated against mercenaries like these before, in countries where the line between military action and private enterprise had blurred beyond recognition. They were dangerous, efficient, and unburdened by the rules of engagement that governed conventional forces. Her comm unit activated with a soft beep. "Diane, this is Liv. Drone shows the Axis team deploying surveillance equipment. They've got a tactical drone of their own now, military grade with thermal imaging." "Copy that," Diane replied softly. "What about Cruz and Walker in the cabin?" "Still secured. The shutters are holding, and life support systems are functioning normally." "Good. Have Sarah and Mike reached their positions?" "Affirmative. Sarah reports their communications specialist is setting up interception equipment. They're trying to locate our frequencies." Diane considered this development. "Switch to Protocol 7. Protocol 7, a communication system they'd developed during a mission in Eastern Europe, designed to evade sophisticated intercept technology by using rapidly changing frequencies and encrypted burst transmissions. "Already implemented," Liv confirmed. "Mike also reports that he's identified the Axis team leader. It's Voss." Diane paused mid-step. "Anton Voss?" "Affirmative." The name triggered a cascade of memories. Anton Voss, former Spetsnaz operative, later a private contractor known for his methodical efficiency and absolute ruthlessness. Task Force Sierra had encountered his handiwork during operations in the Balkans and later in Syria. He was formidable, disciplined, and utterly without scruples. "This changes our approach," Diane decided. "Voss won't be fooled by basic deception tactics. Sarah, are you monitoring?" "I hear you." Sarah's voice came through clearly. "I've encountered Voss before, during the Zagreb operation." "Then you know what we're dealing with," Diane said. "He'll establish a methodical perimeter and work inward, standard Russian hunting tactics." "So we disrupt the pattern," Mike suggested. "Create chaos within his carefully ordered system." "Exactly." Diane agreed. "Liv, can you access the cabin's secondary systems remotely?" Already connected, Liv confirmed. What did you have in mind? Initiate Protocol Chimera. 30-minute delay. Protocol Chimera, a complex series of security measures designed to make the cabin appear to be under attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Lights, sounds, and automated defensive measures would activate in a seemingly random pattern, drawing attention and resources. Chimera confirmed. 30-minute delay, Liv acknowledged. Diane continued moving through the forest, her mind working. Through contingencies. Voss's involvement elevated the threat level substantially, but it also introduced a known quantity. His tactics were predictable if you understood his training. She reached a small stream and paused to refill her canteen, using the moment to reorient herself. The eastern ravine lay a quarter-mile ahead, a natural funnel that could either trap her or provide the perfect ambush point, depending on how it was approached. Her satellite phone vibrated with an incoming message from their FBI contact. Backup. Delayed. Roadblocks encountered. New ETA 120 minutes. Diane frowned. Another 2 hours before official intervention arrived. They would need to adapt their strategy again. She was about to contact her team when a faint sound caught her attention, the nearly imperceptible whir of a small drone moving through the trees above her. Axis Team Reconnaissance. Without hesitation, Diane slipped beneath the overhanging bank of the stream, using the flowing water to mask her thermal signature. The drone passed overhead, its cameras sweeping the area methodically. Once it was gone, she sent a burst transmission to her team. Aerial surveillance active. Implement cold protocol. Cold protocol. Minimizing thermal signatures by using natural features like water and dense foliage to obscure body heat from infrared detection, another technique from their deployment in Arctic environments. As Diane continued toward the ravine, she reflected on the irony of the situation. The skills that had kept her alive through multiple war zones were now defending her home against a different kind of invader. The stakes were different, but the game remained the same. Survive, adapt, overcome. At the sheriff's roadblock, Charlie Weber finished giving his statement to Deputy Rodriguez, describing everything he'd witnessed at Mercer's camp. So these Axis contractors, Rodriguez clarified. They're essentially mercenaries, Charlie nodded grimly. That's what it sounded like. Sullivan, the security team leader, seemed worried about their arrival. Said something about them changing the parameters of the operation. Sheriff Haynes paced beside his vehicle, processing this information. And you're certain Mercer was coercing you to help them approach the Reynolds cabin undetected? Absolutely, Charlie confirmed. When I tried to leave, his men made it clear I didn't have a choice. If Diane hadn't created that distraction, I might still be there. Or worse. The sheriff made a decision. Rodriguez, get on the horn to state. Police and the FBI field office in Denver. Tell them we have armed mercenaries operating on American soil. Harlow, I want additional roadblocks on every access point to that forest. As the deputies moved to comply, the sheriff turned back to Charlie. This Diane Reynolds, based on what you saw, do you think she can handle herself against these people? Charlie recalled the efficiency with which Diane had neutralized the guards and navigated the forest. Sheriff, I've been a guide in these mountains for 20 years. I've never seen anyone move through that forest like she does. It's like watching a ghost, and her friends seem just as capable. Former military. That's my guess, but they're not the ones we should be worried about. Charlie's expression darkened. It's Mercer, the way he was talking, the look in his eyes when I refused to help. He's desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. The sheriff nodded in agreement. Sit tight, Charlie. We might need more details as this unfolds. As Charlie settled into a camp chair with a cup of coffee, he gazed toward the forest stretching before them. Somewhere in there, a widow and her friends were facing down professional killers, all because they refused to be bullied off their land. He hoped they were as good as they seemed. They would need to be. In the cave headquarters, Liv monitored multiple data streams simultaneously: drone footage, surveillance feeds, communication channels, and the cabin's security systems. Years as a communications specialist had trained her to process information rapidly, identifying patterns and anomalies that others might miss. "Sarah, Mike, be advised," she transmitted. "Axis team is deploying in a standard Spetsnaz search pattern. Teams of 2 moving in counterclockwise spirals from the cabin outward." "Classic Voss," Sarah replied, "methodical and thorough." "I count 6 operators total," Liv continued, "all armed with modified assault rifles and sidearms, thermal and night vision capabilities." "What about Sullivan's team?" Mike asked. "They've taken a defensive position around the helicopter. Based on body language and positioning, I don't think they're participating in the active search. They appear to be distancing themselves from the operation." "Smart move on their part," Sarah commented. "Professional security contractors who cross the line into paramilitary operations risk their licenses and freedom. Sullivan's protecting his team's future. Unlike Voss, who operates completely off the books," Mike added grimly. Liv checked the timer for Protocol Chimera, 15 minutes until activation. The diversion would buy them some time, but they needed more than time now. They needed to change the dynamics of the engagement. "I've been analyzing Mercer's calls," she reported. "Based on the transmission patterns and satellite linkages, he's been in contact with financial institutions, primarily. The last call involved significant data transfer, likely financial records being reviewed remotely. His investors are getting cold feet," Sarah surmised. "More than that," Liv replied. "Based on the call duration and subsequent communications, I believe they've withdrawn support entirely." This was a critical insight. A desperate Mercer with nothing to lose was exponentially more dangerous than a businessman concerned with appearances. "Diane, are you receiving this?" Liv asked. "Affirmative," came the quiet response. "Mercer's desperation changes the equation. Voss and his team are mercenaries. They operate on risk-reward calculations. If Mercer can't pay, their incentive structure shifts." "You're thinking of driving a wedge between them," Mike realized. "Exactly. Liv, can you access Mercer's financial data from the files Jason compiled?" "Working on it now," Liv confirmed, fingers flying across her keyboard. Jason's intelligence was thorough. He tracked shell companies, offshore accounts, money movements. Here it is. Mercer's primary operational account at Grand Cayman National. Bank shows repeated transfer attempts in the last hour, all rejected due to insufficient funds. "He's broke," Sarah translated, "trying to move money that isn't there anymore." "Forward that data to my secure tablet," Diane instructed. "I'm going to make Voss an offer." Voss moved through the forest with practiced precision, his senses attuned to the environment around him. Unlike the others on his team, he carried a compound bow alongside his sidearm, a personal preference from his Spetsnaz days. Firearms were efficient but loud. The bow allowed for silent elimination when necessary. Beside him, Carol monitored a handheld device tracking their drone's thermal imaging data. "No signatures matching human patterns," he reported quietly. "They're masking somehow." "Water features and dense foliage," Voss replied knowingly. "Standard counter-infrared tactics." He paused, examining disturbed vegetation along the forest floor. To an untrained eye, the signs would be invisible, but Voss recognized the subtle indicators of recent human passage: a bent twig, compressed soil, displaced leaves. "They're leading us east," he noted, "toward the ravine system." "Obvious trap," Carol commented. "Of course," Voss agreed, "but knowing it's a trap gives us the advantage." He activated his comm unit. "Maddox, Ryden, circle north and approach the ravine from the high ground. Lennox, Fisher, maintain cabin surveillance. Our targets are attempting to draw us away." As he issued orders, Voss's tactical computer chimed softly, indicating an incoming transmission on a frequency it had just detected. Curious, he accepted. The connection. Anton Voss, a woman's voice came through clearly. Task Force Sierra sends its regards. Voss's expression remained neutral, but inwardly he was impressed. Mrs. Reynolds, I presume. Your reputation precedes you, as does yours, Diane replied. Zagreb 2011, Damascus 2014. You left distinctive signatures. Professional courtesy to professionals, Voss acknowledged. Though I'm surprised to find Sierra operators playing with forest rangers in Colorado. Everyone retires somewhere, Diane countered. I chose these mountains. You chose private contracting. Different paths, similar skill sets, Voss agreed. What's your proposition, Mrs. Reynolds? You wouldn't contact me directly without a reason. Check. Your tactical display. I've just transferred financial data you should find interesting. Voss glanced at the small screen, scanning the information with practiced efficiency. His eyebrows raised fractionally as he processed what he was seeing. Mercer's accounts, he noted. Impressively depleted. His investors pulled out an hour ago, Diane explained. He can't pay you, Anton. Not now, not after this operation concludes. An interesting claim, easily verified. Voss switched to a private channel. Lennox, run a payment verification on Mercer's advance. Confirm the escrow. Account status. While waiting for the response, he continued his conversation with Diane. Assuming your intelligence is accurate, what are you proposing? Walk away, Diane said simply. Take your team, return to the helicopter and leave these woods. Tell Mercer whatever you need to save face. This isn't your fight, and there's no payday at the end of it. Professional courtesy between professionals. Exactly. We both know how this ends if you continue. My team has defensive positions established throughout this forest. We've been operating together for over a decade, and we're on home ground. Lennox's voice came through on the private channel. Verification complete. Escrow account shows insufficient funds. Transfer attempt from Mercer failed 20 minutes ago. Voss processed this information with cold calculation. He had no particular loyalty to Mercer. Their relationship was purely transactional. And Sierra operators were not adversaries to be taken lightly, even in retirement. An interesting proposal, he replied to Diane, but incomplete. Walking away means returning to my employer empty-handed. Bad for business. Then take something of value instead, Diane countered. The drive I just transferred contains evidence of Mercer's financial fraud across multiple development projects. Wire transfers, shell companies, falsified environmental reports, enough to interest federal prosecutors or to ensure Mercer's cooperation in other matters. Voss allowed himself a small smile. Sierra operators always understood leverage. Blackmail. Material as a parting gift? Consider it compensation for services rendered, Diane replied, plus whatever Mercer already paid up front. Lennox's voice came through again. Sir, the data appears legitimate. Extensive financial records, correspondence, offshore account details, significant blackmail value. Voss made his decision. In his line of work, survival depended on recognizing when the risk outweighed the reward. A reasonable proposition, Mrs. Reynolds. We'll withdraw to the helicopter and depart within 30 minutes. A wise choice, Diane acknowledged. Safe travels, Anton. The connection terminated, leaving Voss to consider his next steps. Mercer would be furious, of course, but that was irrelevant. The data they now possessed would ensure his cooperation, or his silence, when necessary. Carol, he instructed, signaling the team. Operation terminated. Return to the helicopter. Sir? Carol questioned, surprised by the sudden change. Our employer failed to disclose critical information and cannot fulfill his financial obligations, Voss explained coldly. Contract nullification is standard procedure under these circumstances. As they began their withdrawal, Voss felt a grudging respect for Diane Reynolds and her team. Few opponents had ever outmaneuvered him so effectively, leveraging intelligence, terrain, and psychology in perfect harmony. If circumstances had been different, he might have enjoyed the challenge of continuing the engagement. But professionals recognized when to advance and when to retreat. Today, retreat was the only sensible option. Besides, the data they now possessed was worth far more than Mercer's original payment. Sometimes, the most valuable prize wasn't the one you were sent to collect. Victor Mercer watched in disbelief as Voss and his team emerged from the forest, moving with purposeful strides toward the helicopter. Their weapons were secured, their demeanor relaxed, clearly not the posture of men returning from a successful operation. "What the hell are you doing?" Victor demanded, intercepting Voss. "I didn't authorize a withdrawal." Voss regarded him with a cold indifference. "The operation is terminated, Mr. Mercer." "Terminated? On whose authority?" "Mine," Voss replied simply. "Our contract includes a non-payment nullification clause. Your escrow account failed verification 20 minutes ago." Victor's face flushed with anger. "That's a temporary banking issue. I have the funds." "No," Voss interrupted. "You don't. Your investors have withdrawn support. Your accounts are frozen or emptied. Your financial house of cards has collapsed, Mr. Mercer." He held up a small tactical device displaying financial records that Victor recognized with growing horror as his own private accounts. "How did you get those?" he whispered. "Mrs. Reynolds provided them," Voss explained almost conversationally, "along with extensive documentation of your fraudulent business practices across multiple development projects. Wire transfers, shell companies, falsified environmental reports, quite comprehensive." Victor's mind raced, trying to process how Diane Reynolds could possibly have obtained this information. Then realization dawned. Her husband, Jason Reynolds, must have been investigating him years ago, collecting evidence even before his death. "Those records are stolen," Victor protested desperately. "They're inadmissible." "I'm not concerned with their admissibility in court," Voss cut him off, "only with their value as leverage." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Here's what happens now, Mr. Mercer. My team departs with this data as compensation for services rendered. You never contact us again. You never mention our involvement here. In return, these records remain private for now." "You're blackmailing me," Victor realized. Voss almost smiled. "Consider it a restructuring of our business arrangement. And if I refuse, then copies of these files reach federal prosecutors by morning," Voss replied with a shrug. "Your choice. Though given your current financial situation, I'm not sure you can afford to refuse." Victor's shoulders sagged as the full weight of his predicament settled upon him. Everything was unraveling: the resort development, his financial empire, his freedom, all because of one stubborn widow who refused to sell her worthless cabin in the woods. "What about Reynolds?" he asked bitterly. "I paid you to handle her." "Mrs. Reynolds and her team are former Task Force Sierra operators," Voss explained, with something approaching professional respect. "Elite special forces, Mr. Mercer. You sent us against ghosts who know these woods better than we ever could, who prepared this terrain meticulously, and who exercised remarkable restraint in neutralizing your security team without casualties." He gestured toward the forest surrounding them. "They have defensive positions throughout these woods. They've monitored and recorded everything that's happened here today, and they have federal contacts en route. This was never a winnable scenario for us." As if to punctuate his point, the cabin's exterior suddenly erupted with activity, lights flashing, alarms blaring, smoke deploying from multiple points. Sullivan and his remaining security teams scrambled for cover, weapons drawn. "Diversionary tactics," Voss noted calmly, "drawing attention to the cabin while they maintain their actual positions elsewhere. Textbook Sierra methodology." He turned back to his team, who were already boarding the helicopter. "Our business is concluded, Mr. Mercer. I suggest you consider your next steps carefully." Victor watched helplessly as the Axis team departed, the helicopter lifting off and banking away over the treetops. He was alone now, abandoned by his mercenaries, his financial backers, even his own security team, as Sullivan approached with a grim expression. "My men and I are withdrawing as well," Sullivan informed him. "Our contract doesn't cover this level of escalation, and I'm not risking my team against Sierra operators." "You can't just leave," Victor protested. "Watch me," Sullivan replied flatly. "And Mr. Mercer, I'll be sending my final invoice to your office. I suggest you find the funds to cover it, or our next conversation will be significantly less pleasant." As Sullivan's team packed up their equipment, Victor stood alone in the clearing, the ruins of his ambitions crumbling around him. Somewhere in these woods, Diane Reynolds was watching, perhaps even now documenting his illegal activities for the authorities. His satellite phone rang, the fourth call from his attorney in the last hour. With trembling hands, he answered. "Victor," his lawyer's voice was grave, "the FBI just executed search warrants at your office and residence. They're seizing records related to all your development projects. What the hell is going on?" From her observation point, Diane watched through binoculars as Mercer received the call, his body language transforming from defeated to panic-stricken. The plan had worked perfectly. Voss neutralized, Sullivan withdrawing, and now federal authorities moving on Mercer's business operations. "Diane, are you seeing this?" Sarah's voice came through her comm. "The Axis team is actually leaving." "Your gambit worked," Mike added, admiration evident in his tone. "Using Mercer's financial records to turn Voss was brilliant." "Professional. Courtesy between professionals," Diane replied, recalling Voss's words. He recognized an unwinnable scenario when he saw one. "FBI teams have reached the forest perimeter," Liv reported from the cave headquarters. "Sheriff Haynes is escorting them in. ETA 10 minutes to Mercer's position." "What about Cruz and Walker?" "In the cabin," Diane asked. "Still secure. The Chimera protocol has them thoroughly confused." Diane smiled slightly. "Good. Time to bring this to a close." She activated her satellite phone and dialed a familiar number. "Agent Davis," answered the crisp voice of their FBI contact. "Alex, it's Diane. The target is isolated at the helicopter clearing. Security and mercenary teams have withdrawn. We have comprehensive evidence of illegal activities, including attempted assault, trespassing with firearms, and conspiracy." "Copy." "That," Agent Alexandra Davis replied. "My team is approaching from the South Access Road. You and your people should withdraw to avoid complications with the official operation." "Already planned," Diane assured her. "We'll meet you at the designated extraction point in 1 hour." "Understood." "And Diane, the financial records your team forwarded earlier today? They're gold. Our financial crimes unit is having a field day." "Jason would be pleased," Diane said softly. "It was his investigation originally. He'd be proud of how you finished it," Alex replied. "See you in an hour." Diane ended the call and contacted her team. "Operation complete. FBI is taking over. Execute extraction plan and rendezvous at Point Echo." With a last glance at Mercer, now pacing frantically beside the helicopter, Diane slipped away into the forest. Her work here was done. What followed would be in the hands of the justice system. 3 weeks later, the courthouse steps in Denver were crowded with reporters as Victor Mercer, once the picture of confident wealth, was led away in handcuffs following his arraignment. His expensive suit had been replaced by a simple button-down shirt and slacks, his usual swagger, now a defeated shuffle. From across the street, Diane watched the scene unfold, her expression neutral. Beside her, Sheriff Haynes leaned against his department SUV. 16 counts of fraud, 6 counts of bribery, conspiracy, and attempted assault, the sheriff recited. "Federal prosecutors are saying 20 years minimum." his empire's crumbling by the hour as investigators uncover more connections. Justice moves slowly, but it moves, Diane observed quietly. Sheriff Haynes studied her with newfound respect. You know, when you first moved to Blackridge, folks just saw Jason Reynolds' grieving widow hiding away in the woods. Nobody knew. That was the point, Diane replied with a faint smile. Anonymity was peaceful. Well, for what it's worth, I'm sorry about how this all played out, the sheriff said sincerely. If I'd known what Mercer was really up to— You know now, Diane cut him off gently. That's what matters. As Mercer disappeared into a federal transport vehicle, Diane turned away. This chapter was closing, and she was ready to return home. See you. Next morning, Diane stood on the porch of her cabin, watching the sunrise paint the mountains with golden light. The forest was peaceful again, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves replacing the tension and danger of those harrowing days. Behind her, the cabin door opened as Liv emerged with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Beautiful morning," she commented, handing one to Diane. "It is," Diane agreed, accepting the mug gratefully. "How's the team?" "Mike's still snoring," Liv reported with a small smile. "Sarah's running system diagnostics on the new security setup. She says another day and it'll be fully operational." Diane nodded, appreciating her friend's continued support. They'd remained at the cabin following the incident, helping repair the minor damage and upgrading the security systems to prevent any future incursions. "Any word from Agent Davis?" Liv asked, leaning against the porch railing. "She called last night," Diane replied. "The federal case against Mercer is proceeding. They've uncovered fraudulent activities across 6 states, falsified environmental reports, bribery of local officials, misappropriation of investor funds. He's facing decades in prison." And locally, Sheriff Haynes has been surprisingly cooperative. Turns out he didn't know about Mercer's illegal tactics. He's filed additional charges for the armed trespass and attempted assault. Liv took a sip of her coffee. "What about the resort development?" "Dead in the water," Diane confirmed. "The investors have pulled out completely. Mayor Walsh is facing recall over his involvement with Mercer. And the town is actually exploring more sustainable economic options. Charlie Weber is leading an initiative for ecotourism that would preserve the forest while creating jobs. All because you refused to sell your land," Liv noted with admiration. Diane gazed out at the forest stretching before them, her sanctuary, her home, the place where she felt closest to Jason. "It was never really about the land," she said softly. "It was about standing up to bullies who think they can take whatever they want through intimidation and force." The sound of an approaching vehicle caught their attention. An unmarked SUV was making its way up the dirt road toward the cabin. "Expecting company?" Liv asked, straightening. "Yes," Diane replied. "Agent Davis wanted to deliver some news in person. They watched as the SUV parked beside Diane's truck and Alexandra Davis emerged. The FBI agent had traded her tactical gear for a professional suit, but her alert posture and observant gaze revealed her operational background. "Diane," she greeted, ascending the porch steps. "Olivia, beautiful morning." "Coffee?" Diane offered. "Please." Inside the cabin, Mike and Sarah had risen and were preparing breakfast. They greeted Agent Davis warmly. They'd worked with her on previous operations during their active service days, developing a mutual respect that transcended their now different career paths. Once they were settled around the kitchen table, Davis opened her briefcase and removed a file folder. "I wanted to deliver this update personally," she explained. "The investigation has expanded significantly beyond Mercer's operations in Blackridge." She laid out several documents showing financial transactions, property records, and corporate registrations. "Based on the intelligence Jason gathered and what you provided after the incident, we've connected Mercer to a larger network of development fraud across the western states. Properties acquired through intimidation or manipulation, environmental, Regulations circumvented, investors defrauded. How far back does it go? Sarah asked, examining the timeline. At least 15 years, Davis replied, which brings me to the real reason for my visit. She turned to Diane, her expression softening slightly. We've been reviewing Jason's original investigation files more thoroughly. Diane, there's something you should know. Diane felt a sudden tightness in her chest. What is it? Jason wasn't just investigating Mercer's business practices randomly, Davis explained gently. He was following a specific lead related to a Task Force Sierra operation in Arizona, one where things went wrong. Mike and Sarah exchanged glances, both recalling the mission Davis was referencing, a covert operation to gather intelligence on a suspected arms dealer operating on the border. An operation that had ended with unexpected casualties when their cover was compromised. The arms dealer was a cover, Davis continued, revealing photographs of a younger Victor Mercer meeting with known criminal organizations. He was actually facilitating land acquisitions for Mercer's organization using intimidation tactics against local property owners, particularly on Native American lands. Jason connected the dots after recognizing Mercer in surveillance photos. Diane struggled to process this revelation. Are you saying Jason's final mission was directly connected to Mercer's operations? Yes, Davis confirmed. When Task Force Sierra was disbanded, Jason continued the investigation privately. The evidence suggests Mercer may have become aware of the investigation shortly before Jason's deployment to his final mission. The implication hung heavily in the air. Could Mercer have had something to do with the circumstances that led to Jason's death? It wasn't stated explicitly, but the possibility was there. We'll probably never know for certain if there was direct interference, Davis acknowledged, reading Diane's unspoken question. But what we do know is that Jason's work has finally brought Mercer's entire operation down. He started this, and you finished it. Diane felt a complex mix of emotions, grief freshly awakened, anger at the possibility of Mercer's involvement, but also a sense of completion, of justice finally being served. There's one more thing, Davis added, removing a small box from her briefcase. This was recovered from a safety deposit box registered to one of Mercer's shell companies. Based on the documentation found with it, we believe it was meant for you. She slid the box across the table. Diane opened it slowly to find an envelope addressed to her in Jason's handwriting, along with a USB drive. I'll give you some privacy, Davis said, standing. I'll be outside when you're ready to talk more. As Davis left the cabin, Liv, Mike, and Sarah moved to follow, but Diane stopped them. Stay, she requested softly. Please, your family. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and began to read. Diane, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I've arranged for this letter and the accompanying evidence to find its way to you if I don't return from this deployment. What began as a standard intelligence operation has led me to discover something much larger. A systematic campaign of fraud, intimidation, and environmental destruction orchestrated by Victor Mercer and his associates across multiple states. The USB drive contains everything I've gathered so far: financial records, witness statements, photographic evidence. It's not complete yet, but it's enough to launch a full investigation if placed in the right hands. I'm sorry for keeping this from you. I wanted to protect you from potential repercussions if Mercer discovered the investigation. But I realize now that was a mistake. You've always been my strongest ally, my partner in every sense. Our cabin in the mountains was meant to be our sanctuary when this was all over. A place to heal, to grow old together, surrounded by the forest we both love. If I can't be there with you, know that I'm still there in spirit, in every sunrise over the mountains, in every rustling leaf. Stand strong as you always have. Finish what I started if you can. But most importantly, live fully. Find peace in our forest sanctuary. You deserve that, and so much more. All my love, always. Jason, tears streamed down Diane's face as she finished reading. Her friends remained silent, offering their presence as support while respecting her moment of connection with Jason across the years. Finally, Diane folded the letter carefully and looked up at her team, her family. Jason was investigating Mercer all along, she said quietly. Our fight to protect this land was actually continuing his mission, completing what he started. Mike reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. He knew you'd never back down. That's why he left the evidence for you to find. And why did he make sure you had us to call when needed? Sarah added gently. Diane looked around the cabin, the home she and Jason had planned together, the sanctuary she had defended so fiercely. For the first time since his death, she felt a sense of true completion, of puzzle pieces finally falling into place. Agent Davis is waiting, Liv reminded her softly. Do you want some more time? No, Diane decided, rising from the table with renewed purpose. I've had 5 years of looking backward. Jason would want me to move forward now. Outside, Davis was enjoying the mountain view when Diane joined her on the porch. Thank you, Diane said simply, for bringing this to me personally, for helping us see it through. Davis nodded in understanding. Jason was one of the best agents I ever worked with. Seeing his investigation finally completed felt like the right way to honor his memory. She hesitated, then added, We could use someone with your skills at the Bureau, you know, your entire team, actually. The work you did here, it was exceptional. Diane considered the offer, gazing out at the forest that had become both her battlefield and her sanctuary. I appreciate that, she replied after a moment, but I think my fighting days are behind me. This is my home now, my peace. I understand, Davis acknowledged. But if you ever change your mind, or if you need anything at all, I know where to find you, Diane finished with a small smile. After Davis departed, Diane rejoined her team. In the cabin, the atmosphere had changed. A weight lifted, a mission completed, a chapter closed. What's next? Mike asked as they gathered around the living room. Diane considered the question. For 5 years, her life had been defined by grief and solitude, interrupted only by this final confrontation with Mercer. Now, with that chapter closed and Jason's mission completed, the future stretched before her, unwritten. First, she decided, we rebuild what was damaged, make this place truly secure again. Already in progress, Sarah confirmed. And then, Liv prompted. Diane smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that her friends hadn't seen in years. Then we live. We help Charlie with his eco-tourism initiative. We build something positive here. Something that honors these mountains and forests. Sounds like a new mission, Mike observed. A different kind, Diane agreed. Not defending but creating, not surviving but thriving. As the morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the cabin with golden light, Diane felt Jason's presence, more strongly than she had in years. Not as a ghost of the past, but as an enduring part of her present and future, in this land they had loved, in the justice they had sought, in the peace she had finally found. The widow in the woods had faced down the men who sought to take everything from her, and in doing so had reclaimed not just her land, but her purpose. Her hunting ground had become her healing ground, and the path ahead, though different than the one she had once imagined with Jason, was finally clear. For the first time in 5 years, Diane Reynolds looked to the future with hope, surrounded by friends who had become family, in a forest that had revealed itself to be not just a battlefield, but a beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.